All right. Let's finish notes from the underground today, talk a little bit about books and reading. I want to make a strong connection for you, either to oppose or to absorb yourself between Don Quixote, Alonso Quijada, as well as this underground man. These are two individuals. Let me put this hypothesis above the door at this point, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, self-reliance. It describes the wind above his door. Just as Alonso Quijada, who becomes Don Quixote because of the influence of books on his wits, so does the underground man. Underground man is obviously not his Christian or given name. Turn into the underground man because of the influence of books on him. Now, at first you might think they're a little bit different. Alonso Quijada, who becomes Don Quixote, attempts to become a fictional representation of a knight that never existed in reality in order to reform the society in which he lives back into an age of gold, which also is a mythological concept that did not, which features a place that never existed. Like, and again, if you're religious, see this as a speculative point, like in Eden, for example, or a paradise. Many interpreters see those as speculative archetypes of a place of perfection that never existed in reality. Though, of course, if one is religious, one takes a different perspective on that. Don Quixote wishes to take from his imagination a notion that comes from others' imaginations and to impose it on reality with mixed results, right? He has some effect on those around him, but mostly he has a, here is a $10 word for you. He has a risible effect. Any of you know what risible means? Risu sum in Latin means to condescend, to smile down upon somebody. Something that is risible is similar to something which is ridiculous. Something which is farcical. Something that makes us that's not a good, that was like a genuine smile. Something that makes us kind of smile and ridicule. You know, to smile down upon someone is not the same as to smile at someone. And in fact, you probably know there are different sorts of smiles, like when the corner, and there's a term for this sort of smile, when the corners of your mouth don't go up and your eyes stay small, that's known to be like a non-genuine smile. It's the sort of smile you give to somebody when you're really cultured and they insult you accidentally, when you're like, a current presidential candidate, I would say, is very good at this sort of smile right now. And so maybe there's probably an article out there in the New York Times about that. In any case, Don Quixote, his world is made of letters and words and books and ideas that come from the imagination. What is the underground man's world made from? We see quotes over and over again that when he encounters the police officer, he does not have a very literary situation. When he speaks to Liza, he speaks in platitudes from books. Like there's a character from 2001 work called American Psycho, where the protagonist, who's very much an anti-hero or himself sort of an antagonist in other people's stories. Patrick Bateman is a finance gentleman who viciously murders prostitutes and homeless people in his spare time. But something weird about him is that when he does this, or when he's about to do this in his home, he often turns on music. And then he reports to the person that he is about to eviscerate and show the true mortal nature of their lives. He repeats verbatim reviews of music that he has heard before. It is as if he himself has no identity, has no conscious thinking about what he is, as if he just absorbs that which has been said and thought around him and repeats it out. It is as if he is himself the opposite of an individual, simply a generalized, abstracted, and yet embodied figure of social forces. This underground man, we know that two social forces in particular afflict him at two particular times, and that he himself, from the last 5 minutes or so of the book, if you're listening to the last 2 pages or so, if you're reading, says that How does he say that? Sorry, I'm forgetting why I even said that. I'm afflicted like in seminar. We know, excuse me, we know that in the 1940s, from part 2, that Romanticism is a huge force in Russia at that time. We know in the 1960s, nihilism is a huge force. And so this abstracted individual who is embodied, who himself is described as, and here it is, in the last 2 pages, a person who wishes to be born from one's head, a person who wishes to be himself like a generalized, abstracted idea. This idea, this desire to be a universal human who can see in a universal way comes from many figures, but 2 major figures from the German tradition from the late 18th century and then from the early 19th century. And their works, The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, and The Phenomenology of Spirit by G.W. Hegel, released at the 19th century's Mind in Motion, also the 20th century. A figure that you may have heard of before that was deeply influenced and was himself a left Hegelian by Hegel was Karl Marx. Karl Marx, who himself came up with very powerful socialists, will later be communist or adopted by communist theories. He took his systematizing view of economics and polities largely as an adaptation of Hegel. And there's a lot that scholars debate about how much he took, how much he didn't take. There's plenty to be said there, but this is sort of basic outline. And so in the philosophy of Hegel, the systematic philosophy, you might see this as a systematic philosophy or a systematic way of looking at the world that seeks to show somebody what is happening and what the purpose of what is happening is. The fact that such a system for observing reality exists indicates something. What does it indicate? What has been slowly diminishing, disappearing in the text that we have been reading, to the point that you don't even really see it, perhaps don't see it at all in Notes from Underground in the middle of the 19th century. The place of religion. And so it is almost as if these attempts at philosophy, with the rise of secularism and the expansion of many, many, many forms of Christianity in the forms of many Protestants, Presbyterianism, Episcopalianism, Lutheranism, all the way down to Appalachian snake handling, which is a real Protestant denomination. It's as if with the coming of science and the scientific revolution, yet one of the many revolutions we see, scientific revolution, religious revolutions, industrial revolutions, people are seeking, particularly the most intelligent luminaries, like a Goethe, like a G.W. of Hegel, like a Kant. They're searching for a new lens through which to observe and to interpret the world. They're trying to make meaning of a world that potentially, and this isn't necessarily true of Hegel and Kant, who were themselves avowed Protestants, they are trying to make meaning of a world that potentially has not what? Very important concept, this. God, that's right. Why do you do anything in a world that, and so let me pause. I said on Friday that there are capitalist elements to Christianity when thought in terms of Santa. There are also capitalist elements of Christianity when one thinks in terms of heaven, right? These ideas developed alongside the birth of capitalism, by the way, through the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, with the development of cities and the development of the idea of purgatory in Catholicism. But what is the basic idea? You have free choice. You do a set of things during the course of your life, and you receive what at the end of it? What is that? But what is that? That's a form of what? Reward, right? Well, that sounds awfully similar to working some job with a contract that you set out in the beginning, and then receiving your due, what you have merited, right? There is a certain narrative that is laid out in front of somebody. If you do X, Y, Z, you will receive A, B, and C. And that is quite nice. For standardizing a sort of life, and perhaps even is promoting of a certain way of life that individuals can live in harmony with each other, ideally. But once you pull out the foundation stone of a way of living, does that way of living, think in terms of architecture, continue to exist? Can it do anything but fall? Imagine that ways of living are subject to gravity, a gravity of their own. And so we find ourselves with very confused individuals. How confused are we? Well, think about the underground man. Is he reading the Bible? No. Is he reading the Quran? No. Is he reading any religious texts? No. He's reading works of philosophy and difficult literature in order to do what? Understand himself and his situation, and potentially where society, which he rejects, has gone wrong. It is perhaps correct of him, for him, like Don Quixote, to reject society, particularly in its manifestation in the middle of the 19th century. Surely it has many problems. Surely it is going in many directions and misdirections that could be reined in or perfected or improved. And yet, just as Don Quixote enmeshes himself, inures himself in his delusion, it has a risible effect on the world around him, a limited effect, maybe a deep effect on us as readers, but not as deep an effect on characters like the Duke and the Duchess. Maybe a little bit more on the priest and the barber, and certainly on Sancho. And maybe the biggest thing one can do is to have an effect on an individual and not on society itself. Even if we were going to use a Christian example, Jesus seems to have had a bigger effect on those 12 apostles first. And then from them, everything else came. Well, interesting idea there. But the underground man, how does he wish to impose his ideas on society and to change society? Does he attempt to put his ideas into action? Well, insofar as his ideas are sort of nihilist, and remember that nihilists are people who believe in nothing, which seems to mean that they believe in the value of nothing, that all the world is a flat plane, as it were, that to say, speak evilly to a prostitute named Liza and to send her away after ridiculing her so hard that she attempted to leave her madam in her whorehouse, and to then attempt to make herself an honest person by coming to this underground man, just to be spitefully led away by him. In his mind, as morally evil as that entire scene might have seemed, and is in fact described by him at the end of the text, by his own philosophy, what is the difference between those acts? And so let me suggest, in the place of God, something that starts to be felt by the literate and the philosophical. There's a degeneration of standards. When there is not a path laid out for one to walk in order to achieve excellence, the question naturally arises, what is excellence? What is goodness? What is right? And why ought I live some difficult path that may merit something good at some point that is undefined scientifically? Why not just live however I want to? And this is the place that the underground man finds himself in. But I want to hedge this like a hedge fund with the ideas of pragmatism. Sure, these are dark thoughts. Behold, how could this underground man be equivalent to you, for example? You are yourselves sterling star students who are going to make something. You're surely not going to be somebody who lives in a dirty little apartment that shows one's squalid poverty and then spends 16 years in one's head effectively doing nothing. Of course not. Of course not. And yet, is it precisely what the underground man achieves that is supposed to demonstrate the value of what he thinks? Where has he gotten himself? What have his ideas produced in his life? Is he the sort of character you would like to be like? Does he have the sorts of things you would like to have? Is the fact that his life is so insipid and dark supposed to be an argument against how he thinks? Say one thing to you. And I'll say this is not a scholarly thing, but sort of an adulty thing to say to my young adult students. When you are at the age you are at right now, when you speak to people who are at similar ages, the value of their ideas is unclear to all. They have not gotten anywhere based on their ideas yet. They have not failed to get somewhere based on their ideas. But as you start to get into your 30s, maybe some of you are there, into your 40s, you will see the effects of the thoughts and the decisions of your friends and perhaps your close family members on their lives. You will see that I think that way of thinking is perhaps not the best way of thinking, because now you've gone bankrupt twice, or you've been divorced several times. Maybe you see that's a good thing. That's okay. But you will see things happen to people that are based on their decisions, which are themselves based on their reflection. And you will then have the power, as you get a little older, and you may have it now, you're probably developing it, to see that it was really their ideas that led them astray. And so my question to you, all this thinking, all this brilliance and intelligence, this underground man, where does it get him? And if it doesn't get him anywhere or somewhere you would want to be, what is the value of all that thought? And so when we approach true modernism in Ulysses and we see the morass of it, it'll be very much like reading the image Guernica by Picasso, which I put up early on in Don Quixote. I'll put up again at some point. It's the work that shows a major massacre, as well as a bull's face very famously on it, and sort of a sideways woman screaming. Is that though we are entering an era where it is unclear what is up or down, there are still ways to judge for yourself what you think is good or bad, though perhaps you are limited to seeing what is subjectively good for you and what is subjectively bad for you, rather than what is absolutely good and what is absolutely evil. Because what sort of person would you have to be able to see the absolute, based on what we said earlier? Could you be an individual and see absolutely? Absolutely means loosened from all considerations. What is it that we already know about being a human? Using the word perspective. And this is actually what makes you interesting, unique, and important, since you live in a collective. Do you see absolutely? No, if we saw absolutely, would we need to communicate? Wouldn't we all see the same thing? Well, what is it that's important and yet totally limiting about you? And is the reason that you can speak. Your brain, but I want to go a little forward in the physiognomy as we use a little bit of metonymy here. It is your what that is important for sharing with others. Your perspective, that's right, because to some extent it is unique from others. And well, this is actually kind of scary, because if there's not one unified perspective I can receive from a single book or figure, what do I have to do to figure out what is going on in a modernist era? Can't just read the Bible. Can't just read any religious text, apparently. Can't read these great philosophers alone either. What do you have to do? Yeah, what do you have to do? You have to absorb a lot of perspectives, right? And yet, what we see in Notes from Underground is that just absorbing a lot of perspectives is no guarantee that you will be successful in seeing what it is you want and achieving it either. So I think part of what being in a modern or postmodern world entails is is that it's very difficult to understand what's going on. And if you look at contemporary discussions about, say, the role of the media, the role of platforms like YouTube and TikTok, where people get their information, you will see that this is very much an ongoing conversation. And this is why I attempt to teach you how to use things like databases and a scholarly library, because these are sources of information that, if, of course, not perfect, are much, 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 much more reliable than that which is publicly accessible at one's fingertips. Though much harder to use and to understand, but better tools are often harder to use. And so imagine the difference between wielding a wooden stick and a nuclear weapon, for example. One is a much more sophisticated device than the other. All right. I have said a lot of things about Notes from Underground that I'm happy to have said about Notes from Underground. I want to talk a little bit about an aspect of it that is certainly very modern that you might want to write about or focus on in it. Metafictionality. We talked about metafictionality before, and the fact that metafictionality is when a piece of fiction addresses and shows itself conscious of the fact that it is in fact a work of fiction. The most common example of this in, say, stage dramas or television, when a character so-called breaks the fourth wall. So there's a wall to their left, their right, behind them. The fourth wall is the audience or the lens of a camera. And if, say, you've seen The Office, it's when a character looks at the camera and gives it a meaningful look. They're breaking the fourth wall. They're including you in the drama. The usual division between irony and dramatic irony is dissolved. And so, comment on the title. The author of these notes and the notes themselves are both, of course, imaginary. All the same, if we take into consideration the conditions that have shaped our society, people like the writer not only may, but must exist in that society. Try to present to the public in a more striking form than is usual a character belonging to the very recent past, one of these romantic, then nihilistic souls. It's almost as if romanticism in youth leads to nihilism in age, which would make sense given the rejection of naturalism and of aging in romanticism. In the chapter entitled The Underground, this personage, that's an interesting way of describing, not as a character, not as a person, but a personage. That's obviously a translation, but a good word to have translated this Russian word into. Introduces himself and his outlook on life, his Weltanschauung, his perspective, and tries, as it were, to elucidate the causes that inevitably brought about his appearance in our midst. In the second section, we follow personages' memoirs of some of the happenings in his life. So this is a character who is representative of the individuals around him. A question you might well ask yourself, and you might have been asking every time I said something similar to this, is how does this form of character differ from any character in any work of literature? Aren't they all generalized representations of individuals or types of individuals that exist or may not have existed at some time? I mean, and probably did. Even when you have to say like aliens or like dragons and different species, don't they often have personalities that are reminiscent of human personalities in some way or another, often anthropomorphized faces that look like humans? And things like that. When Scar kills Mufasa in Lion King, spoiler alert, one understands his motivations. He wants to be king, which is not something that a lion can be because they don't have monarchies. They have pride. The notes continue on, more metafictionality. But the transcription or narration leaves off. This is very important. This is very similar to what we experience in Don Quixote when there is an unreliable, you might question this, there is a narrator who himself is receiving a translation from a true historian or a truly writing, or a historian who writes true chronicles named Cid Hamete Benengeli. So we don't really know within the fiction of the text where the story itself comes from. In Notes from the Underground, we have a first-person narrative almost the entire time until the very, very, very end of the text, when the Underground Man says he's going to finish writing, but then he contradicts himself, surely due to spite. But apparently another narrator has been behind him the entire time and cuts him off. And so, where is this story truly coming from? Has there been a narrative all along guiding this underground man or alongside this underground man? How much of what the underground, so here's one of the bigger questions. If there is in fact a narrator who can cut off the underground man and we are denied the remainder of his ramblings, how much of the underground man's thoughts have been edited out in the first place? Are we even receiving his full perspective or the perspective of another? This is like relying on me for my perspective on Ulysses or Notes from Underground, right? It might seem in the moment to be somewhat correct, and yet, if you don't have the full perspective yourself, can you really see what's true and what's false? And so, the notes continue on with the transcription or narration leaves off. Soon we shall invent a method of being born from an idea. That's enough. I shall write no more from the underground. This is not the end, however, of the notes of this paradoxical writer. He could not help going on. But to us, too, it seems that this will be a good place to stop. To us, too. This us, this royal we, is often the scholarly we. Those who use the first person plural are usually those who are so informal that they no longer use the second person, or somebody who has attained a certain rank. There's, of course, the royal we, because a king historically speaks for his society. But there's also the scholarly we, where a scholar speaks for his, her, or their subject, because one becomes a representative of that. At your point, you are not truly a we, because you are not a part of an organization that you have had to receive a credential or license in order to join. You might say something like we, the drivers, if you have a driver's license. Or if in fact you are a member of a guild or trade, you could say we then too. But that is, those are the conditions under which one often says or writes we. If you've been wondering, why do I sometimes see we, I, you, they, there are subtleties of meaning, and there are considerations for these sorts. That said, this is not the end, however, of the notes of this paradoxical writer. He could not help going on. But to us, too, it seems this will be a good place to stop. So he never truly stops himself. Use of the first person, like Goethe, draw us on high, like Dante, our life. There's something inclusive and interesting there, but I think what I said prior to that is more interesting and closer to the dial as well. Like Don Quixote, this problematizes the introduction. The written account of the story differs from the story itself. We don't know how much of the story that the underground man wished to convey to us is in fact being conveyed to us, because we are receiving this story of the underground man from yet another narrator who's apparently either compiled or revealed to us some amount of what has been written by this extraordinarily spiteful individual. All right. There's a lot more in this presentation that I think could be interesting if you're really wanting to spark some ideas on the midterm essay, which is due 1 week from today. But one thing I would like you to focus on that it perforates all of these texts is, what does it mean to act ethically, morally, in these modernist texts? I want you to really think about how these protagonists act. And perhaps I've got something here that's pretty good. Oh yeah, I even include Don Juan. So Don Quixote rejects modernity in favor of a delusional return to life in a pastoral or chivalric romance. He does return to his senses and confess and write a will prior to dying, but as has been noted by many students, he breaks the law several times. He impoverishes several individuals by either stealing something from them, like the helm of Mambrino, which is a watcher's basin, or cutting open their sacks of wine, but he does end up paying for some of these sorts of things. Is he acting in a way that you would define as ethical or unethical, good or bad? Put it politely. Don Juan, remember him. He rejects conventional morality by seeking constant and immediate sensation through unceasing sexual conquest. He is dragged to hell at the end of Don Giovanni, which is his Italian name, screaming an emphatic no to the command of repent. want you to start seeing these individuals as people who are perhaps confused, that perhaps do not see a direction in their world, or if they do see a direction, they see it as the wrong direction. So they make a choice to go in a different to go on a different trajectory. And yet, where does it lead them? Perhaps a thought you might be developing at this point is, can you truly reject the society in which you exist with ethical or good results? Or do you in some way have to engage with the world, the society in which you exist at the time in which you exist, if you wish to do good? Or even, and this is perhaps a different thing, to have a good life. Perhaps this is an even different thing, to have a meaningful or happy life. Which of these texts is going to teach you how to do that itself? Do they show individuals who have achieved those standards, or do they themselves show individuals who have failed to achieve those standards? Are these cautionary tales? Or are these, again, supposed to be elucidating, illuminating tales that show you the way? In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope has a dream that's very easy to interpret, about an eagle descending and killing many lesser birds. Odysseus interprets that for Penelope in disguise, she not knowing that her husband is right in front of her. Perhaps this is an allegory for when you first meet the person that will become your spouse. Do you know that they will be your spouse upon first meeting? Romeo or Juliet? And she, in where I was going with that again, tough day. I'm trying to keep up with you, really, I am. But then this is what happens when you go out on branches. And you forget the trunk. I'll come back to it. Faust rejects conventional morality and makes of all the world an object for his desire. He's perhaps the clearest example of what we might consider not ethical. Asocial action. He seduces Gretchen. He pursues fame. He pursues Helen of Troy, a literary ideal turned into a woman with whom he has a child that does not last very long. He pursues military conquest, land, and political power. And yet, he dies after experiencing a prolonged moment of bliss, considering the good his actions will do for others. And unlike Don Giovanni, who refuses to repent at the end of his life and dies and is dragged to hell, Faust is saved. What is up and what is down between these two? In the underground man, he refuses to act or to do anything at all, because everything, according to the systems of philosophy that he has returned, or that he has absorbed, ingested, has told him that life is predetermined. The philosophical word for this is determinism. So we use the term to be determined as, like, say, you got a strong personality and you see things through. But truly, determinism means that the social, physical factors that exist in the world are real, and that they force you like a robot like a stimulus response robot into the ways of thinking, deciding, and acting that you act upon. To be a true determinist, to be a hard determinist, as it were, is to believe that you have no human freedom. But one strange thing about this philosophy of determinism is that it doesn't account for a certain faculty that humans seem to have that is important to them if they are going to deserve something good or bad. What is the difference between, say, you and a robot at this moment? Perhaps not in a week, perhaps not in a month, the times we live in. Robot, by the way, the Yiddish word that means slave. What's the difference between you and a robot? Free will. Well, right. If you don't have free will and everything you do is determined, why do anything? Aren't you just compelled and forced to do everything you do? I think students, when they hear this, they think this cannot possibly be in its truest, most absolute form how reality is. You do seem to have, even if you're deluded and you act against your own interests, you probably think and feel that you have some sense of agency and choice in it. You might not have as much as you want. You might not have as much money as you want. You might not be able to achieve everything you want in this moment. But can you hold out some ideal or goal in front of yourself and then choose to act towards it? The real freedom may be in how much freedom do you truly have, rather than do I have it at all? And this is why I recommend that you develop as many skills as possible. Old Baruch Spinoza himself, a modernist philosopher, says, the greater the power you have over yourself, the greater the power you have over the environment in which you exist. And I think that is a good thing to hear and to ponder as a person, particularly a young person who has so much in front of him or her. All right, the underground man refuses to act or do anything at all because he is predetermined. Though he does argue that man is irrational by nature, that he would seek to upset even the most rational of systems in order to stick out his tongue at it. That's, well, perhaps that's the question I should leave you with the underground man before we move on to a very brief introduction of Ulysses. Would you settle for that being the purpose of your existence? Stick out your tongue at the prevailing systems of thinking in the society in which you exist at your time. Okay, sure, you're disrespecting it. What effect do you have on a system of philosophy by sticking out your tongue at it? That's like saying that you dislike an opera by Mozart, Don Giovanni, for example. Will that, at this point, really affect the status of Mozart? Or will that affect the status of the opinions that the culture have about you? Something to consider as we live in this transforming and transformative world. All right, these are excellent quotations. I would really take a look at these quotations that I'm not going to read right now because I lack the time to do so, but I'm going to say a few things about what makes this text a piece of modernism, a piece of metempsychosis, and a piece which I would consider a masterpiece, or at least I would argue is a masterpiece. Note, the chronology of the text works backwards. Note also, the protagonist is unique in that he is a spiteful individual. He is an envious individual, and he willfully wishes to be both mentally and physically sick, though he lives in a society that has the tools to ostensibly cure him, at least of his physical maladies. Perhaps he does not live in a society where that is equipped to deal with his mental ones. Psychoanalysis and psychology start to get very large right after Dostoevsky. And in fact, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that the only psychologist he ever needed to read was Fyodor Dostoevsky. So very interesting that the coming of psychology as a science is almost directly after the time of Fyodor Dostoevsky. He, as an existentialist and as a very powerful thinker, is often seen as one of the roots, the deep roots underground of psychology. In any case, the lack of a name, the text or the titular character, the underground man, it's not his given name. So his name, like Don Quixote, is changed. Faust's name may also have been pseudonymous. I told you that Faustus means lucky or help or happy, excuse me. The underground man is more of a constellation of ideas than a character. That expression is a very useful expression, constellation of ideas. Think about what a constellation is. It's a bunch of stars that themselves make a form. It is like he is one attribute, a second attribute, and a third attribute. You put them together, become a personality or a personage. That's what to constellate means in this sense. And then the tackling of modern philosophical issues, romanticism and nihilism, by experimenting with the formal constraints of the medium. That's a very sophisticated way of saying that this character and his representation is itself like an experiment by Dostoevsky of what would such a personality, if infused into his 1840s and then 1860s world, what would he be? How would he act? What would he think? What would he achieve? And if this is a true representation, a good representation of what these attributes, which are so powerful at Dostoevsky's times, are, is this a representation of the direction his society is going? If it is this the direction you think he would want it to go? Is this the direction you would want your own society to go? which itself is very much influenced by modern. We find ourselves in post-modern times, sometimes called post-postmodern times, in the last 20 years. Next, metempsychosis. The underground man joins a host of archetypally modern characters like Hamlet, Don Quixote, Don Juan, and Faust, all very much afflicted, confused, though all very smart. Don Juan maybe not as much. The underground man is typical in his name, but is utterly self-conscious in his initial description. He starts with I, the first person, illustrating his perspective, not another's. And yet, his perspective seems to be an amalgamation simply of others, right? He has absorbed the thoughts of others. This critical evaluative faculty, his ability to put these thoughts together and make them work for him, not quite as strong, as if he, like I said, Patrick Bateman, is repeating that which he has heard without ingesting and understanding what he has heard. It's like when you have something happen to you and somebody just repeats a cliche to you. Who are you to say that? Do you have any understanding of this situation at all? Like, say you fail at something and somebody says, well, you can't win them all. And you're like, have you experienced true defeat? Do you really know what it's like to lose something that you value and to have to bounce back from that in that sage quote that you've just given me in cliche form? One wonders. The underground man is a representation of the effect of Western European philosophy and rationalism on the Russian consciousness, which creates nihilism. It is a strange mixture of something produced in a culture not his own. It is a set of alien ideas, German ideas. They come from a different, a place with a different religion. You know that the 19th century Germany was very much a Protestant place. You may know that Russia, and Russia still, though not during the Soviet era, which allowed no religion, is a Russian Orthodox. It's an Orthodox sort of place. Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy are themselves forms of Catholicism. And they themselves split off from the Catholic Church prior to the Protestant Revolution hundreds of years prior. And so they are Catholic in their own way, very different from Western Catholicism. So this is an individual who's influenced by ideas that come from an alien culture and perhaps fails to absorb them and make them his own. Perhaps they themselves turn him into something of an alien. And note that alien means other. That's like, so when you hear illegal alien, someone's not talking about, green-headed dude who I draw in pink. The big eyes. And you've seen those stickers? I don't know. How are aliens represented now? Are they still green with big heads and like black eyes without irises? So you don't think they have souls so that you can fight them. Masks are useful as well. In any case, just a little bit of a hodgepodge. Nekrasov and Turgenev circulated a satiric poem in which the young writer was called, like Don Quixote, the Knight of the Doleful. So it was very interesting. It's about Dostoevsky itself. All right, masterpiece. I'd call this a little masterpiece. It's not a big masterpiece. Like I said on Friday, a little bit more like a filet mignon or a foie gras, not a tomahawk steak, not a super large Chicago pizza. The substance of this work is in the skill that created it, not in the size that was created by it. Same thing with much French food, where if you're very hungry, I wouldn't recommend necessarily eating a very fine meal. They're not often huge. Go get the tomahawk steak. Yeah, which is itself sort of a representation of American values of success, right? We like big things. We have lots of space. We like big food. We like big cars. We like big houses. We like big. Go to Europe. Go to Latin America. You'll see how big America truly is. Dynamic representation of self-revelation and delusion of a pathological personality. Chaos of conflicting emotional impulses. I'd really like you to think about what these words mean. Self-revelation and delusion of a pathological personality. Pathology. Pathology is a disease, is a problem with you, a physical problem. So the study of pathology, study of pain. Pathos means pain, logos means study of. And so what does it mean to have a pathological personality? We have definitions of such personalities now. Do you know what text in which we include those? The DSM-4, maybe DSM-5, 6 now. I remember it was back in the text revision when I was last looking at it. But yes, now we have codified pathological personalities, in fact. A chaos of conflicting emotional impulses. What's a chaos? Conflicting emotional impulses. What would the opposite be? A cosmos or a harmony of harmonized emotional impulses? What has this character's reading done to him? Has it helped his integrity? Integrity comes from the word energy, means wholeness. So to have integrity means to act in such a way that suggests to people that you are a whole. So say, if you're known for being very strongly moral, the more times you act morally, the more people think you're acting according to your integrity. Yet, if you have a strong reputation for that, and in fact have a strong character, you act against it. People sometimes think that that hurts your integrity, that was beneath you, is a way that we often say this sort of thing. He refuses to treat his liver out of spite. Is this the most spiteful character that you have ever witnessed in fiction? I'd really be interested to see if you know of a character, anime, television, movies, TikTok, PewDiePie, YouTube commentator. Those are fictionalized characters too, by the way, even if they're based on real people. Have you ever known a character more spiteful than this one? And then he says, and I guess this is where I'll end things today because I have to, and we didn't quite get to Ulysses, but now the ground's set. And I say to hell with it, as long as I can still have my team. And I say to you, the heck with this class, please enjoy your Chick-fil-A afterwards. And we're truly, truly starting Ulysses next time.